This is accounting ethics. I'm with a bunch of accountants, so it's a subcategory, I suppose, of business ethics, which itself is a subcategory of moral reflection, which is then a sort of a subcategory of the sort of reflection on our civilization as such. So I'm very interested in aesthetics. So I'll just scroll down. So I've tried to include various images. Here's our first author, Brooke Harrington. I love postage stamps because they fit really well on like an online setting. So the postage stamps I use are sort of thematic. Cook Islands is one of the great tax havens on the planet, and the first section's on tax havens. So one of our theorists, Edmund Burke, Anglo-Irish. And here's Hannibal Lecter teaching Clarice about something. And here's Hannah Arendt, of course, the obligatory cigarette in her mouth, chain smoker. And then here's a contemporary philosopher, Alain de Botton. And, bizarrely, there was this movie, right, called The Accountant, which was... So that's Ben Affleck, right? Yeah. So he's an accountant who's like a killer, right? And so I've always been sort of intrigued, like, what is the accountant? What is the role of the accountant in our society? And so, at the end, I have them reflect a little bit with the help of Ben Affleck and this de Botton bloke about what is an accountant. And that's actually the guiding thread throughout the course. I'll just point to one other thing before I sort of get into it a little bit more that I kind of like. So I did a bunch of voice threads, and I'll show you how I introduced those. And again, I took postage stamps to kind of give a kind of a thematic. For each voice thread, there's a postage stamp that makes sense of it. Okay, so because I like graphic stuff. Okay, so for my Camtasia, I actually did this thing on consolation and desolation. This goes to Gloria's point about cura personalis and the Jesuit component. I actually think this is very, very important. Especially for social presence, because the cura personalis idea sort of wants you to think about our students as a whole person. So this made me think about both engaging their emotions. So as we go through the various assignments, and a component that I use all the time is, okay, how did you emotionally react to that material, to that video? And so there's intellectual cognition, and then there's emotional cognition, or in business parlance, right, EQ, right? So I've systematically worked on that. And that's also why I like the voice thread, because it embodies them. So they have to be physically, like I can see them, they gesture. And I talk about that in their assignment. So that's what I did. I kind of tried to give them some pointers on what that consolation desolation idea is. And basically, desolation, I would say, is loneliness. This makes me feel lonely somehow. Consolation, this puts me into communion with others. So that's what I did there. And I've got things like how you will be marked, the grading and the objectives. And I thought really hard about the objectives, doing that backward design thing. So then let me go to Brooke Harrington, right? So she published a book with Harvard University Press, and it's about tax havens. How did tax havens work? Who uses them? And who manages them? And of course, oftentimes who manages a tax haven is an accountant. And it raises all sorts of moral issues, both political moral issues and, of course, personal moral issues, right? Because inside tax havens, of course, there is secrecy. And so what happens to family wealth inside these secretive conditions? So she wrote this awesome book about this. So we start with her. But then what I do is... the next, actually, no, we'll skip that one. That was cool, but we'll skip it. So then Burke, so the weird thing about this is Burke uses the idea of the trust. A trust, when people have a trust fund, that is the primary mechanism by which families' wealth is transmitted from one generation to another. And the trust fund is usually put on a tax haven to keep it away from national government from getting its hands on the trust. So this guy, Edmund Burke, in the 18th century, he was the guy who first theorized this idea of the trust. So we get into him. But so let me go to this though, right? So this 20th of June, 26th of June. So in my voice thread, I give them instructions on how to think about their VoiceThread exam on Harrington, but it's not just on Harrington. What they've got to do is combine Burke's thinking with Harrington, right? So it's always combinatory. It's always analogical thinking, right? So this goes to the kind of cognitive aspect where they're not having to sort of replicate anything, right? They're having to creatively, so it goes to taxonomy, Bloom's taxonomy thing. They have to creatively engage and combine materials. So I give them instructions in the VoiceThread how to do that, and then they give me a 2-minute VoiceThread, which is their exam on how they in fact combined Harrington and Burke. So we do a Zoom discussion, and then the forum is I put open student discussion, and sometimes I put open discussion. Open discussion, I'll be there, sometimes talking, but I also want a place where they can just go. So here, actually, what I want them to do is, we do a Zoom thing, and then they go into their own forum, and they can ask each other, like, God, how do we do this? Like, what are you doing? All right. So, because I'm okay with that, right? I'm okay with them sort of working together like that. And let me see if there's anything else interesting. So, well, same thing, right? On the 27th of June, an open student discussion, same idea. Again, another VoiceThread on Burke. But here I'm asking them to, how does Burke help them think about what it means to be an accountant? Let me think. What else would be? I'm only going to kind of do things that I think might be using the technology in a sort of interesting way. And then we do some of the classic Enron, of course. These are these sort of classic accounting scandals. How did those happen? And then they've got to use moral theory to elucidate why those happen. But I also do the cura personalis thing there as well, the consolation desolation thing. So sometimes it's me. So like on 18th of July, so it's a hybrid. So there I'll be teaching them moral theory in a traditional classroom setting. But sometimes like it's remote, right? So this whole session they're going to do by themselves, asynchronously, this one. Other ones are synchronous, right? So like when I was using the Zoom thing up here. Basically, my thought is when we're doing like really hard stuff, I better be involved. And then there's a moment when actually I release them into their own autonomy, right? When they finish, actually, ultimately, it's all remote and they're doing their own thing because hopefully by then I've trained them and they can do it. Let me give... So in each case, they have pre-lection questions. So like this thing here, Arendt on Eichmann, an analogy to business. So this is, I give them pre-lection questions, short answer, low stakes, and they do that. And then we're also going to do a discussion amongst ourselves with me involved. And then when we do get more Eichmann and Arendt. So Arendt came up with this famous idea called the banality of evil. It's a very interesting moral idea. And she was connected obviously with the final solution and all this sort of stuff, right? So it's pretty heavy, right, material. But so again, they've got their VoiceThread instructions on how to do the exam. We meet all together for us to discuss this moral theory, and then they can go off and talk about that amongst themselves later. And then finally, it all comes together in a reflection on the life of the accountant, and hopefully then the moral requirements that our civilization demands of the accountant, right, to ensure the free flow of markets, the protection of wealth, etc., is the idea. So those are the tools I'm using, why I'm using them. I think it builds in social presence quite well, actually. I think it brings in a lot of high cognitive functioning. And of course, teacher presence is just obviously in the Zoom, in the classroom, when I'm doing a very more sort of traditional lecturing, that's there as well, right? So for me, I wanted to come to this workshop because I wanted tools to push the work onto the students and away from me. And I must say these tools, I believe, will deliver brilliantly in that regard. I'm really excited about this. So in other words, I wanted to minimize the teacher presence component and really emphasize the cognitive and the social presence for them. So that's roughly what I have.